Okay, I'm going to talk about the case for abolition. I use the word abolition deliberately because the opposite of prohibition is freedom, but the opposite of abolition is slavery. What I think we need to do is reorient what you could call the liberty or the libertarian rhetoric of doing the right thing about tobacco. It will free us up to get rid of tobacco. It's not a loss of a choice. It's an enabling, an empowerment, because the key fact is that almost all smokers wish they didn't smoke. Now, if I were in person, I would do what I call an agnotology survey. I begin with a series of questions, and I'll ask you just to think about them. What makes a fish move? In the United States, 90 to 95% of everyone will say fins, muscles, something having to do with the individual. But if you go to the Yupik of Alaska and you ask them this, they know that it's currents that make fish move. Fish don't move themselves, especially freshwater, saltwater fish. Currents move, and that's how we need to reorient our thinking about tobacco. Is we are part of currents, and not everything is in the individual. The two of the greatest problems facing us, strategies of the industry, are invisibilization and individuation. Invisibilization of the actions of the industry itself, and individuation of the epidemic, that this is all about individuals, when in fact this is the world's deadliest industrial catastrophe. So we need to recompose the injuriat. And if you ask number two, how many cigarettes are smoked every year? Again, 90, 95% of everyone will underestimate, because the number is 7 or 8 trillion globally. And so that's 350 million miles of cigarettes, enough to go around the Earth 13,000 times at the equator. A third question I like to ask, are cigarettes inherently dangerous? I learned this in court. They're not inherently dangerous. They're dangerous by design. That's very different. And a knife is inherently dangerous. A car is inherently dangerous. But a cigarette is defective, and I'll talk about that more. I ask, what's the most dangerous radioactive isotope in smoke? And very few people know that there's radioactive polonium in cigarettes. I ask, when did the Federal Aviation Administration stop requiring ashtrays on planes? And what's interesting is that every plane must have ashtrays, because people are so addicted, they still smoke in the bathrooms. They put their face into the bottom of the toilet and light the cigarette and blow it and flush. And so that's how addicted. So next time you're on a plane, check the bathrooms. There's an ashtray in every bathroom, and that's to prevent people from putting out their cigarettes in the trash and causing the plane could go down. I just published an essay with Dan Axelrad, Why Did Philip Morris Stop Making Cigarettes at Auschwitz? Most people don't know that Philip Morris made cigarettes at Auschwitz. Then I ask, in what year was peak US cigarette death? And the answer there is now. We're now experiencing peak death. And then I ask, a dollar invested in tobacco in 1900 is worth how much today? And it's worth about $12 million. So it's a 19% annual return for the past 125 years. It's the most profitable business enterprise in human history. It's very important to think about our framing of discussion. Too often we think only of the smoker, not enough about the cigarette as a defective product, and too rarely about the industry itself, which creates the product, creates the deception, creates the epidemic, and has done through the three principal theaters of the cigarette conspiracy, namely litigation, regulation, and public opinion. Those, in their own secret documents, they talk about we have to win the lawsuits, we have to control the regulators, and we have to keep people smoking. Those are the theaters of the conspiracy, and we need to move upstream to think about what I like to call the causes of causes, as opposed to being catarrhumatic and only thinking of downstream causation of the individual smoker. Okay. These, again, are the three chief strategies of the industry. They individuate the epidemic into a simple matter of personal choices. They invisibilize their own agency in creating the epidemic and keeping people smoking, even though most people wish they didn't smoke. And they like downstream causation. They don't want us to see the light, to look upstream and to see who's actually constructing the epidemic. And when we think of, this is from the Surgeon General's report, and it illustrates how even at the highest levels of the public health community, there's often a co-optation of rhetoric. This is from the 2010 Surgeon General's report on how tobacco smoke causes diseases. And you'll see the chain of causation goes from the individual cigarette at the top here to disease. But the cigarette itself has no cause. It is the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. The industry, the agency of the industry itself is invisible in much of our public health rhetoric and conceptualizing. And we need to realize that if something is an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, that's basically Aristotle's definition of God or nature. And we need to recognize the cigarette as a construct, as a deliberate object, as a defective product, as a deception. These are some of the facts I mentioned. There's about 6 trillion cigarettes smoked every year, about 500 million kilometers of cigarettes if you were to line them up end to end, which is enough to circle the Earth continuously 13,000 times at the equator. Enough cigarettes in 1 year to stretch from the Earth to the sun and back, with enough left over for a couple of side trips to Mars. So we're talking about a massive epidemic, a massive catastrophe. Cigarettes are actually smoked faster than the rate at which satellites orbit the Earth. About 15 kilometers of cigarettes are smoked every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And these cause around 8 million deaths per year, a number which will continue to rise for a certain period of time. And they cause a great deal of environmental damage. There are now several lawsuits in the United States that are focusing on the litter cleanup, not the health consequences, but the litter cleanup, and trying to get city municipalities to sue the industry for cleanup costs, because by piece, cigarette so-called filters are the leading source of plastic litter on the planet. If you think about the trillions smoked every year, and so these are just tossed onto the ground and an important source of microplastics. This is the arc of the epidemic. The blue line is the number of cigarettes smoked every year in the United States. The red line is the death chart. And as you can see, whereas the peak of the causes is in 1981, the peak of the effects is 40 years later. That's the time delay, which historically has been important because it explains why it took so long for people to discover that cigarettes cause deadly harm. But also it's important because that time delay is what makes it so seductive to the youngster just starting to smoke. A 16-year-old, a 12-year-old who's just starting to smoke doesn't think about what it's like to be 50 or 60 or 70 with emphysema and bronchitis or heart disease. These are the big numbers here. In the United States, there were 30 trillion cigarettes smoked in the 20th century versus only 30 billion, that's 30,000 million in the 19th century. So we have a factor of 1,000 more in the 20th century than the 19th century. And cigarettes kill 1 person for every million smoked, which is a very convenient fact because you just divide by 1 million the number of cigarettes smoked in any country like the Netherlands, and you get how many people will die from cigarettes, those cigarettes smoked. Okay, the 3 causes of the epidemic: mass production, mass marketing, and mass deception. Mass production begins in the 1880s. Mass marketing is really from the 1920s on, and then mass deception is pretty much from the 1950s onward. Mass production begins with the invention of automatic cigarette making machines like the Bonsack machine, which instead of rolling only 200 cigarettes per person per day in the era of hand rolling, one of these machines could roll 100,000 cigarettes per day. And newer machines, and so these are the old hand rollers. All cigarettes used to be rolled by hand by women and girls in factories. The new machines are hundreds of times faster than the Bonsack machine. This is the Haoni Protos M8, which can roll 16,000 cigarettes per minute. There are some that are even faster than this, and that helps explain why we have such a mass surplus, you could say, of cigarettes. And what was the response? Well, once you have mass production, you need mass marketing to dispose of this huge supply of cigarettes. And so billions of dollars have been spent to market cigarettes in the United States, growing from only about $360 million spent per year in 1970 to a peak of about 13 billion per year. That again, 13,000 million dollars per year in 2005. Mass marketing cigarette makers invented many of our modern marketing techniques. Cigarette makers invented baseball cards to stiffen the packs, and they would put themes on the cards, opera singers and natural events. Cigarette makers invented skywriting, so you could fly a plane over Times Square saying "Lucky Strike" means fine tobacco. And it's all about impressions. We too often think about facts or information when the conveyance, the marketing is all about impressions. It's about affect. It's about attention. It's about excitement. It's about adventure. And so that we have erotic cigarettes, we have Life brand cigarettes and Peace brand cigarettes. We have even death cigarettes, which are supposedly additive free, luckily. We have sports brand, literally hundreds of brands of cigarettes are sporting brands. We have medicinal cigarettes. And on the bottom right here, in case you think the tobacco industry has not been socially responsible, they were concerned here and they recommend at the bottom here, not recommended for children under 6. So there is some sense of a social conscience. That's Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes to treat your asthma. For the breath conscious, there's mouthwash cigarettes. There's even religious brand cigarettes. I'm not sure why you would want 3 nuns in your pipe, but I'm not sure why you'd want even 1 nun in your pipe. But this brand was advertised. There's Revelation brand tobacco. There's a lot of racist brands. I won't even read these off. There's deracialized brands. You have a brand on the left there, and then you have the brand on the right called Bigger Hair Tobacco. That transition is made in 1942. You have cigarettes for physicians. You have cigarettes for athletes. And I'll talk more in a second about the important bond between food and tobacco, because one of the chief strategies of the industry is foodification. So all of the ingredients in cigarettes are certified as safe according to food criteria, but it's very different to eat a substance and to burn and inhale it. And so that GRAS criterion, generally recognized as safe, is developed for foods, but then it's applied to tobacco. And it's one thing to eat a pistachio, but it's quite different to inhale a pistachio. And that's the difference between chewing and choking and drinking and drowning. The route of exposure is very different. The gut is more resilient, and there's cell shedding, and you can eat a piece of gravel and you won't die. But if you inhale a piece of gravel, there's a good chance you'll die. And the cigarettes were advertised beginning in the 20s to fight the obesity epidemic. And the packaged pleasures revolution that had brought us candy bars and ice cream and soda pop, all within a matter of 20 or 30 years, in the so-called packaged pleasures revolution, the tubularization of the world that arises with condensed pleasures from sugar and electrical manufacturing, large-scale manufacturing. Cigarette makers cast the cigarette as a way to fight the obesity epidemic and created this competition and then originally a bond with the sugar industry. And so by the 1930s, you have unions that are formed. And even today, the unions of cigarette makers are the same as the unions of candy makers. It's the confectionery workers' unions. And uh, you were supposed to reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. And that got the tobacco industry in trouble with the sugar industry. And so they created bonds. And sugar is actually the main reason cigarettes cause cancer because it makes a mild and inhalable smoke. But sugar is also what bonds the sale of the retail space. Cigarettes are sold at the so-called impulse buying area of the gas station, along with the Slim Jims and so forth at the cashier. So you face the candy and you face the cigarettes, and these are the impulse buying. So there's a very important and poorly understood bond between the sugar industry and the tobacco industry. In fact, Philip Morris becomes the world's largest food producer by the 1980s. They own Kraft and they own they're manufacturing Oreo cookies and Altoids and basically the rise of junk food is created partly by the tobacco industry using the same technologies of brain manipulation and construction of the bliss point, it's called the optimal satisfaction, and essentially addictive foods created on the model of addictive nicotine. So foodification is very important. Now, I'm not sure which brand is being advertised here, but research might show that it's a Marlboro brand. Further research, I guess we need on that. There's radioactive cigarettes in case there's not enough natural radiation in cigarettes. There's Nazi cigarettes and cigarettes. The Nazi regime actually, the brown shirts, most of their funding came from their sale of cigarettes. They had four brands: Storm brand, Front brand, Sturmzigaretten. And that's a little known part that I explored in my book, The Nazi War on Cancer, which I think you'd find interesting. There's communist cigarettes on the lower left. They have Laika, the first dog in space who died in space, but that's a brand of cigarettes. They are Sputnik brand, the Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. There's Labor cigarettes. There's Snooty cigarettes. There's Harvard brand cigarettes. These are all cigarette packs that I'm showing you. There's Princeton brand cigarettes. There's Stanford brand cigarettes. There's Berkeley brand cigarettes. There's Amsterdam brand cigarettes. I thought I should throw those in for today's talk. Huh. There's cigarettes for prisoners. These are made by the Florida Division of Corrections. There's cigarettes for presidents. Every presidential vehicle used to have its own brand of cigarettes. Presidential campaigns had their own cigarettes they would hand out. Cigarettes for Christmas. There's an old B actor by the name of Ronald Reagan who's advertising Christmas-themed Chesterfield cigarettes. There's True brand cigarettes with nothing to hide. There's fictional cigarettes. There's cigarettes for your dollhouse. You can find cigarettes in video games. You can find them in a number of different kinds of toys. There's cigarette charms for the ladies. There's cigarette trick books, how to hide a cigarette, how to do a magic trick with a cigarette. There's cigarette cookbooks. Marlboro, Cook Like a Man, The Last Male Art Form, Grill It, Smoke It, Barbecue the Heck Out of It. There's candy cigarettes for kids, Just Like Daddy, which was basically a training in gestures, how to have children. Again, part of this bond between candy and cigarettes that's so important. in the retail space, in the actual brain chemistry, and in the fact that, again, it's cigarettes that make smoke inhalable and therefore super deadly and defective. It's actually the chief defect in cigarettes is the sugar that's trapped from the heat treatment known as flue curing. These are Harvard brand candy cigarettes, allowing you to be just like daddy. And by the way, the cigarette makers did not make candy cigarettes themselves, but they encouraged candy makers to make candies that would look just like cigarettes. Sometimes they had a little puff of white pouch of white sugar that would look like smoke, but they encouraged their production and in very faithful additions. And one of the companies, Brown and Williamson, actually sends its artwork over to the candy maker to make sure that the candy cigarettes would look exactly like the real thing. Again, training and gestures for the young people to start smoking. There's Barbie cigarettes. These are Camel #9, light and luscious, which came with lip gloss and accessories. Organic cigarettes, that's one of the few brands, American Spirit, that's rapidly increasing in sales, the so-called no additive, all natural additive free brand with the cartoon Native American on it. Cigarette says love. Here the guy's smoke ring transforms into a diamond ring. If you give someone cigarettes, you're giving them the gift of love. Cigarettes as porn. Some countries have banned figural images, and so here the cigarette packs have been creatively refigured in various erotic styles. Cigarettes as cosmetics. This is Jennifer Lawrence holding her lipstick in a cigarette-like manner, and this is the Dior Addict brand. So addiction as desire. When the reality is that, and this is an important confusion by the industry, they want to tell us that addiction is desire or the satisfaction of desire, but in fact, addiction is the frustration of desire. Addiction in the medical sense is the frustration of desire. It's the obstacle to what smokers want, which is not to smoke. Again, that's the significance of addiction as pathology. It's the frustration of what people want. I learned this by talking to lots of smokers, and they would tell me that, please don't just tax it because I'll pay whatever. I'm addicted. Ban it. And it was really, when I first started working on this, it was really only the smokers who were willing to talk about abolishing the sale of cigarettes. Cigarettes as speech. This is Philip Morris talking about Virginia Slims as a way to find your voice. Of course, cigarettes actually deprive many people of their voice through laryngeal cancer and ripping out the vocal cords. Cigarettes as enigma. This is the famous Silk Cut brand. Again, images only of silk and cut, and they're very clever. Cigarettes as a kind of castration theme here, a can with the business end being the sharp blades of the cigarette. Silk and cut. Very simple. Cigarettes as riddle. Here, we have the imperative here is light up a camel while you're waiting for the bus. Light up a camel while you're waiting for the bus. And much can be done with images. And one document of the industry says that people don't read magazines, they look at the pictures. So the tobacco industry has been the master of imagery and suggestion and impression, which is a more powerful form of rhetoric than information or text. And again, they dominate image. They don't need text as much. This one here, I mean, what does this one mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's a frog, it's a spaceship, it's silk cut. Again, they're creative at capturing attention, and that's a key point to marketing is capturing eyeballs. Mass deception. So I've mentioned mass production, which created the volume, mass marketing, which creates the desire, and then mass deception, which begins, we can date it to the very day, and December 10th, 1953, Paul Hahn, president of the world's largest cigarette company, American Tobacco Company, invites all of his other cigarette makers to the Plaza Hotel in Washington, in New York City, and they create the world's deadliest conspiracy. It's an adjudicated conspiracy. That's the Kessler decision of 2006. These are federal racketeers. We can say that these are adjudicated racketeers, and that conspiracy begins, as is well documented, at the Plaza Hotel and has extended pretty much ever since, with some little bumps on the road. They set up the Tobacco Industry Research Committee to foment distraction research, becoming significant funders of basically ABC, anything but cigarettes. Viruses as a cause of cancer, genetics as a cause of cancer, environmental pollution, air pollution as a cause of cancer, anything but cigarettes. And over 8,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications came out of this. No one has ever loved science more than Philip Morris. They love science so long as it blames something other than cigarettes and puts the causality inside the individual. Individual genes are the problem, individual immune response, personal choices, all choices removed from the industry itself. The Tobacco Institute becomes the nerve center of the conspiracy. They established the Truth Squad, which went on radio and television 300 hours per year, broadcasting the doubt is our product message. We need more research. You can prove anything with statistics. Mice are not men. All the animal experiments prove is that mice should not smoke. They employed humor. And they also had, this is not sufficiently appreciated, internal brainwashing. In other words, things like the College of Tobacco Knowledge, a kind of policing effort to make sure everyone within the conspiracy, within the industry, was on the same page on causation, addiction, what they called the primary issue. That's their code for cigarettes causing cancer. They had a dean, they had a provost. It's an elaborate self-policing, brainwashing college that occurred 17 or 18 times. The Committee of Counsel, this is the supreme authority for the entire conspiracy, the top lawyer of each of the companies. There's 20, 30 or more of these instruments of the conspiracy. Dead bodies like Arise, which gave rise to things like the Mediterranean diet, that all we need is really a glass of wine a day, a cigarette, a couple cigarettes a day. And we all know that if cigarettes cause physical harm, at least they cause mental benefit. And so this was the idea: you can actually be more healthy by smoking because you can have the occasional glass of wine, a few cigarettes, and you'll be relaxed. Stress causes disease. They'd created that theory through stress theorists like Hans Selye, the father of stress. The idea that heart attacks are caused by stress, not cigarettes. That's essentially invented by the industry, promoted by the industry. So if cigarettes can relieve stress, they can actually prevent heart disease. They penetrated the federal government through the Tobacco Working Group, corrupting the National Cancer Institute. They corrupt the American Medical Association for about a dozen years between 1964 and the late 1970s. The American Medical Association was given $20 million by the cigarette makers as part of this distraction campaign, delay campaign, denial campaign, so-called third-party strategy. Get other scholars to carry water for you. And other groups as well. The Center for Indoor Air Research, that was the group that in the 1990s especially funded hundreds of scientific articles to say that exposure to smoke other people's smoke does not cause lung cancer. This had been essentially proven in the early 1980s by Hirayama in Japan. It's almost common sense that it's true. I mean, if smoking causes cancer, then breathing other people's smoke will certainly cause it as well. But through bodies like the Center for Indoor Air Research and Healthy Buildings International, the industry argued that the problem was not the cigarette in the workplace, but the absence of ventilation. And they invented the sick building syndrome. They, by this means, kept cigarettes on airplanes, in restaurants, in bars for much longer than they should have been. And that was the so-called social acceptability problem that they were worried about. Okay, there's many other of these. At least 25 Nobel laureates have taken money from big tobacco. Again, part of this ornamental authoritarianism, this use of scientific authority to boost the reputation of the industry as a corporate, a responsible corporate citizen. British American Tobacco actually created a unit to fund the study of corporate responsibility. And even now, the cigarette makers advertise themselves as fundamentally green industries. Um, Deceptive rhetorics. Marita was talking about this. There's code names in the industry. Zephyr was one of their code names for cancer. Borstal was their code name for benzpyrene. So there are documents that talk about Borstal causing Zephyr. And you have to know their codes to know that this means that benzpyrene is causing cancer. Compound W was one of their codes for nicotine. Satisfaction was another code for nicotine. The industry pushes young adults as code for cancers. We're not marketing to kids, we're marketing to adults who happen to be young. Tar and nicotine is their code for cancer and addiction, or flavor and satisfaction. It goes different ways. There's no tar and nicotine. Tar is just condensed smoke. Nicotine is one component of it. There's no tar and nicotine as separate objects in the real world. They got us to talk about smoking and health instead of cigarettes and death. They talk about an issue instead of a problem or a catastrophe. An issue really requires nothing. A problem requires a solution. A catastrophe is a big deal. And so they've been very good at developing softening rhetorics. Environmental tobacco smoke, they talk about instead of passive smoke or secondhand smoke. And even public health scholars, when they talk about cessation, it's invariably about cessation of the individual, cessation of consumption, never cessation of production. Again, we need to avoid the cataramatic downstream causation and go upstream. The industry likes us to talk about ingredients instead of additives, but we're not talking about a cake here. They like us to talk about risk instead of harm or cause. They like us to talk about filters or low tars and lights, all of which are fraudulent terms. And if you actually look at the design of the cigarette itself, there's at least 10 design reassurance frauds where the fraud is built into the design of cigarettes. Toasting is flue curing, which actually just made cigarettes milder by trapping the native sugars in the leaf, making them more dangerous, mild, but more dangerous. Menthols made cigarettes less irritating. Menthols is what we call an initiation defect. Anything that makes it easier to start for young kids is a defect. It's an unnecessary, avoidable feature that causes increased harm. King sizing, the tobacco industry invented, which they called natural filtration because tobacco was its own best filter. And 14 years after king size cigarettes, you get the world's first king size beds. So again, it's an example where a marketing concept is invented by big tobacco and then carried over into other parts of consumer culture. Cigarette makers say cigarettes are filtered. They're not. Filters are like a seatbelt made of wet spaghetti. There's no sense in which a filter filters smoke. The smoke is identical that comes out. Cigarettes have been advertised as low tar. They're not. The same kind of smoke comes out. Cigarettes are advertised as light or ultralight. Those are all based on the deceptive metrology of those smoking machines that they developed, which were deceptive. Certain cigarettes are advertised as natural or organic. Not so. I mean, an atom bomb is as natural as a natural cigarette. Additive-free cigarettes are no safer. So these are 10 of the most important design reassurance frauds, meaning, and by the way, they're all defects also because one standard of defect is anything which creates a false impression in the consumer. All of these things made cigarettes seem safer. Toasting made cigarettes seem safer. Menthol seems safer. They're less irritating. Filters, the very word filter implies safety. Additive free implies safety. And what about menthols? This is the ultimate greenwashing. A third of all cigarettes in the United States are mentholated, though two states have now banned the sale of menthols. No one said menthol cigarettes until the 1950s. If you do an Ngram search on the frequency of that expression. And what happens is the discovery of the massive hazard in the early 1950s. That's when you get the jump in the rise of sale of filtered cigarettes, so-called, the jump in the sale of menthol cigarettes. Menthol gave cigarettes a medicinal chill. Physicians were used to argue this. This is the cool penguin, Dr. Cool, he was called, with the stethoscope. On the right there, Republicans and Democrats can disagree about many things, but they agree that their brand should be cool cigarettes. Okay, so there's this big shift in the 1950s. Science proves the harms through animal experiments and epidemiology, clinical pathology, basic chemistry, finding known cancer-causing agents in the smoke. The conspiracies formed at the Plaza Hotel. You get a shift from overt to implied reassurance, the rise of these gimmick brands like filters, low tars, menthols, and new marketing techniques, including sampling, giving out free cigarettes, power walls, where cigarettes are displayed in almost like a billboard behind the cash register, funding of festivals, product placement, and movie placement. And doubt is our product. And it worked. Sales skyrocketed. Sales could and should have begun declining in the early 1950s. And in fact, there's that important blip there in 1953 when cigarette sales went down for a little bit. But the conspiracy restored confidence in the cigarette, and sales continued to rise in the United States until 1981 when there's new taxation on cigarettes, and the peak of 630 billion starts dropping, and now we're below actually 200 billion cigarettes smoked per year in the United States. But profits soared and keep soaring. The tobacco industry is the most profitable industry in human history. As I mentioned before, $1 invested in cigarettes in 1900 is worth over $12 million today. Cigarettes become more affordable over time. And you have interesting techniques being used in advertising, things like in a magazine, they will say you can't have a cigarette ad anywhere near an ad for a funeral home or for hair removal agents or laxatives or feminine hygiene products. So there's a kind of visual architecture and conceptual architecture in the placement of these ads. They can't be near anything that will suggest something causing harm, namely what was called antithetical adjacency. And agnometrics, cigarette makers actually explored how much ignorance they could create by a single viewing of an ad or a film. They made propaganda films, and they would show the film. Before the film, they'd say, "Do you think cigarettes cause cancer?" And a certain number would say yes, and then they would show the film, and that would drop by 17%. So they're actually able to create ignorance through their propaganda and then to measure how much ignorance was created. And that's one reason that they pushed toward what they called the less educated market. They actually had codes for this, the LE market. They knew that the less educated you were, the more likely you were to smoke. They explored the power of symbols, finding that the horse was the best way to break the parent-child bond, the symbol of rebellion and maturity and independence. And that's why horses feature in so many cigarette ads, and then also later motorcycles as well. Again, menthol is sometimes, it's called part of an additive-free cigarette, but they add it to the filter, not the tobacco, which then migrates throughout the product. Okay, candy ball, you crush the Camel Crush and it produces a burst of menthol in the filter. And they're also using synthetics. There's two states have banned menthol, and so cigarette makers are producing non-menthol cigarettes that have a compound called WS-23 and WS-3 Wilkinson Sword, which is a cooling agent, which is not menthol. So they're just able to shift over to an analog to avoid the regulation. And finally, are cigarettes inherently dangerous? No. A knife is inherently dangerous. A gun is inherently dangerous. A motorcycle is inherently dangerous. But cigarettes are not inherently dangerous. Instead, they're needlessly dangerous, avoidably dangerous, unnecessarily dangerous, and therefore unreasonably dangerous, which is the legal definition of a defect. They're not inherently dangerous. They're defective, meaning they defective by design. The three principal defects being inhalability, which is thanks to the sugar, combustibility versus other products, which are heat not burn devices or even e-cigarettes. And they're unnecessarily addictive thanks to the maintenance of nicotine, which is unnecessary in a cigarette. Again, sugar is the principal defect. Flue curing traps the native sugar in the leaf. Throughout Netherlands today, cigarettes are over 20% sugar by weight because of the use of flue cured tobacco. That's an unnecessary addition, which is the sole cause of almost all of the lung cancer in the Netherlands. Sugar makes cigarettes milder versus nature in the raw, one of the advertising campaigns for toasting, where the guy is civilization, which is toasting, which is flue curing, and the native is the nature in the raw, which is basically pipe smoking, which is not inhaled and is harsh. Combustion defect is from the failure to heat rather than burn the tobacco. The addiction defect is from keeping nicotine at 2% by weight in the rod versus truly denicotinized cigarettes, which are about a 20-fold lower level of nicotine. Menthol is an initiation defect, as I explained. And again, it's one of the 10 design reassurance frauds. And there's multiple frauds on every pack. This is Marlboro Lights, which says it's lowered tar and nicotine. That's not true. It says they're lights, which is not true. It says they're filtered cigarettes as well. And that's also not true. The only true is Veni Vidi Vici, which is I came, I saw, I conquered. Okay, so what is to be done? Simple solutions take the nicotine out of cigarettes, require that the pH of smoke be 8 or higher, like traditional tobacco prior to the 20th century, which did not cause lung cancer. Allow at most heat not burn technology, though that has its own defects. And this would solve most this would solve most of the problem. But as Hippocrates said thousands of years ago, in searching for the obscure, do not overlook the obvious. Abolition, not prohibition. Every state, every town and community in the United States, at least, has the power to ban the sale of cigarettes. This was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 1900. We have more power than we realize. The industry is not omnipotent. And it would fulfill the industry's promise. The cigarette makers used to say publicly that they would not make cigarettes if they were ever proven to cause harm. They've obviously broken that promise. Most smokers wish that smoking was banned and wish they didn't smoke. So in order to enlarge human freedom, we should get rid of cigarettes. And I'm also happy to broaden it out to discussion of, again, ultra-processed foods and things like that, because many of the same defects can also be found in ultra-processed foods. Thank you.